So hopefully that bell work was a nice review over it's everything we talked about the past few days, right? Okay. So it's a nice little review looking at that information again here. Okay. So now we are moving on to our next piece of legislation that was passed this time in 1854. So we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this one's a little long, not too bad though. A lot more reaction, okay? So these next few events, basically pretty much right after this, the Compromise of 1850 and then Uncle Tom's Cabin, we're going to see a lot more reactions to these events, to these pieces of legislation being passed, okay? So, why did it happen? Okay, we have an Illinois Representative Stephen Douglas. Okay, he's going to introduce this act because he had a railroad plan to pretty much build a railroad from Chicago, connecting it to the west. Because again, the railroad did not that huge Union Pacific, right? When we talked about the railroad, that line did not exist yet. That was not for another actually 10, almost 8 years later. Okay, but he was trying to this railroad plan, and he was trying to gain support, especially Southern support, because the Southerners, they were like, no, we should build a railroad from New Orleans to the west. Basically, they wanted a railroad in the south versus going in the north, right? And so in order to kind of gain support, he came up with this Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, so this Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to divide the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Okay, so the Louisiana Purchase, and we'll see it on the next slide as well with the map, would be divided into two territories, one being Kansas, one being Nebraska. And both of these territories, even though, okay, they lie north of the Missouri Compromise line, and what was the Missouri Compromise line again? Yeah, no slave states above this line. No slave territories above this line. Okay? Even though they were both above this line, this act would allow popular sovereignty. And what's popular sovereignty again? That people vote to decide if there's slavery or not. So both of these territories would allow popular sovereignty to decide this issue of slavery. And so obviously this act eliminates the Missouri Compromise line. Well, the North is very unhappy with this act because it's repealing the Missouri Compromise line, right? They're like, this Missouri Compromise was made so there is no future debates about which territories, which states enter the Union would be free and slave, right? Especially because, remember, that Missouri Compromise line really more applied to the land in the Louisiana Territory. And so we see, right, and then obviously the South, they have strong support, right? They're like, yes, more opportunity for an area to become a slave state, right? More opportunity for a territory to become a slave territory. And so we see strong support for this act in the South. And even with the North unhappy with it, this act did pass. And so it happened, okay, and since this act passed, right, we see a lot of anti-slavery groups rushing to Kansas to vote. We see a lot of pro-slavery groups rushing to Kansas to vote. Some even coming from Missouri and voting, some even pro-slavery groups coming from Missouri and voting illegally, right, which is going to anger. And so what happened is the pro-slavery group won, right, the vote, and so the territory would be open to what? If they won, it would be open to slavery, right? The pro-slavery group won. They got more votes, right? And so now they are in control of the legislation, right? And so this obviously angered many Northerners because, one, they were like, people voted illegally, right? People came in from Missouri just to vote pro, because remember, Missouri is a slave state, right? And so they're saying, oh, people were voting illegally, and so even though the territories legislation, the government had a pro-slavery majority, we see a anti-slavery group forming their own legislation in Kansas. And so actually there's now kind of like two legislations going on in Kansas, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery. What problems do you think that's going to cause? Okay, which one's legitimate? Which one is the president and the national government going to uphold, right? Which one are they going to say is the legitimate government? But then what's going to happen? I mean, one anti-slavery legislation, one pro-slavery legislation. Do you think they're going to get along? No, and they're both trying to say that they are governing the territory, right? That's not going to work. That is definitely not going to work. We see it even today with two groups on opposite sides of the political spectrum, right? They're butting heads. Okay, and so on the next slide, I do have a map to kind of show you a visual of this. And then we're going to, pretty much the next event is kind of the effect of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, this effect of a anti-slavery group in this territory and a pro-slavery group. Basically, there's two groups, right? An anti-slavery group and a pro-slavery group. All right, we good? Okay. So here's a map. Okay. So you see that Missouri Compromise line is like a blue line in this one. Okay. And so you see Kansas and Nebraska, they're both above, right? Okay. And so they are open now to slavery by popular vote due to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, but look, they're both north. And so that's why a lot of Northerners at first were very upset with this. And then became even more upset when Missouri people came over, okay, and voted illegally in Kansas to make the pro-slavery group win the majority. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and move on. So here we have what became to be known as Bleeding Kansas. So a couple of years later, after the act was enacted, okay, so a pro-slavery group attacked anti-slavery men in Lawrence, Kansas. Okay, and so in retaliation to that, anti-slavery men led by a man named John Brown, and he's actually going to come. We're going to learn more about him next week as well, because he led some other groups. Okay, so John Brown and other abolitionists, they went and attacked and killed 5 pro-slavery men in retaliation to that pro-slavery attack in Lawrence. Okay, along the Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas. This became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Okay, killing 5 people. Kind of very similar to our title, the Boston Massacre, that we learned about in the fall, right? That only killed 5 people as well. Why do you think they're calling it a massacre? Okay, propaganda value is a big thing, right? Being able to show, like, look at, especially pro-slavers, right, are going to be saying, look at this massacre these anti-slavery, these abolitionist people caused. And so this Pottawatomie Massacre, it led to kind of almost a mini civil war between anti-slavery groups and pro-slavery groups. They were clashing then due to these attacks, and it eventually killed over 200 people in Kansas. And this became known at the newspapers called this Bleeding Kansas, because look at all this fighting, this violence happening between these two groups. Right? Kansas is bleeding. Kansas, there's all this fighting, all this violence happening. This even happened and led to fighting going on in the Senate. So so Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, he went on and was like talking about like this going on, this fighting going on in Kansas, and pretty much he was blaming, right, especially Brooks, and so right, he was kind of like calling him out and whatnot, and what happened is Brooks, and I'm gonna show you on the next slide as well, but Preston Brooks, he came into the Senate and beat Charles Sumner with a heavy cane. It took him 3 years to kind of recover from that. And right, a lot of the Southerners, that's why for the South's reaction to the Senate, a lot of the Southerners sent Preston Brooks like canes and basically were like, yes, he got what he deserved. Right? And so again, it's leading to violence, and North was like, thought this act was more evident that slavery is leading to violence. I mean, we're seeing this, right? Violence after violence happening here. Now it's getting even more violent, right? Okay, people are fighting in Kansas. People are now fighting in the Senate, in the government. And so, right, we see this turning towards violence, basically, especially between pro-slavery groups and anti-slavery groups. So I do have some pictures to show you in the next slide. While I'm showing you the pictures, once you're done with this, you can screenshot it and submit for part 2 today. Okay. We go down this slide though, the information. Okay, so here's the pictures. Okay, the top left one, kind of a drawing depicting bleeding Kansas, the fighting going on in Kansas, the violence going on in Kansas. Okay, and then the bottom right is that what I was telling you about the fighting in the Senate. So that's Preston Brooks beating Charles Sumner with a cane, and that is a very definitely famous drawing, famous picture, because I mean, like, again, not only is it leading now to violence and fighting there, in the country, but then also look at the government is starting to become very divided, right? We have 2 distinct groups now, very divided, very divisiveness. Okay, so go ahead, submit